On a crisp autumn night in 1974, the laughter of children and the crackling of campfires at Briarwood Campground suddenly fell silent. By morning, 3 campers, 2 teenagers and a young child, had vanished without a trace. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from their tents. Just an eerie, unsettling quiet that settled over the woods like a heavy fog. Locals whispered about the cursed lake at the campground, about shadows moving among the trees, but the police closed the case as unsolved. Within weeks, the site was abandoned, the gates chained shut, and Briarwood faded into ghostly obscurity. For nearly 50 years, the story lived only in old newspaper clippings and the memories of a dwindling town. Parents used it as a warning to keep their kids close, and hikers avoided the trails that led too near the boarded-up cabins. It became one of those local legends that no one could prove, but no one dared forget. But in the summer of 2024, the silence was broken. A group of drone enthusiasts, exploring the overgrown campground from above, captured footage that has since left investigators, locals, and viewers around the world frozen in disbelief. What their cameras recorded wasn't just an abandoned site. In the stillness of the forest, in the shadows where the cabins once stood, something moved, something that shouldn't have been there. At first glance, the footage shows collapsed roofs, ivy-covered fire pits, and trees reclaiming the empty trails. But frame by frame, as the drone panned over the lake, a shape surfaced, human-like, pale, watching from beneath the water before slipping back into the darkness. Some dismissed it as a trick of light, a digital glitch. But others recognized something familiar in the figure's outline. Something disturbingly close to the missing child who vanished 50 years ago. The footage has been verified. No edits, no tampering, just raw, uncut recording of a place most people swore they'd never see again. Now, experts and eyewitnesses are asking the same question. Did the missing campers ever really leave? Or has something been waiting at Briarwood all these years? And here's where the mystery deepens. The drone didn't just capture a figure. It caught something else, an object resting at the bottom of the lake. Something that matches the description of an item one of the teenagers had the night they disappeared. What lies hidden beneath the waters of Briarwood? And why, after 50 years of silence, has the campground decided to show its secrets now? Briarwood wasn't always a place whispered about in fear. Before 1974, it was the pride of Hollow Creek, a small Texas town where summers meant tents, fishing lines tossed into the lake, and nights spent roasting marshmallows under the stars. Families traveled from neighboring counties, and the campground was often booked out months in advance. But behind the cheerful facade, Briarwood carried shadows that most townsfolk ignored. Old records mention strange drownings in the lake long before the campground was built. Locals recalled hearing sounds at night, echoes, whispers, and splashes with no source. A few even swore the water reflected shapes that weren't there. But when 3 campers vanished without explanation in October of '74, those whispers became impossible to ignore. The investigation that followed was exhaustive. State police combed the grounds, dogs were brought in, divers searched the depths of the lake. Nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not even disturbed earth where the kids' tents had been. The case file was sealed with the words, "Unsolved, presumed lost." For families, that word lost carried unbearable weight. Parents refused to believe their children had simply walked away. Some insisted the campground swallowed them whole. Others said the police overlooked something obvious. But as years passed, grief hardened into silence. The campground gates rusted shut, and Briarwood was swallowed by vines and time. Fast forward 50 years, and the drone footage has torn open those old wounds. For the first time in decades, surviving relatives are speaking out. One of them, now a gray-haired man in his 60s, was the older brother of the missing child. In an interview, his voice cracked as he admitted something he'd never told investigators. The night before the disappearance, his brother whispered that he had seen someone standing in the trees by the lake. Someone who didn't belong there. That confession has fueled speculation. Was the figure in the drone footage a person, or something tied to the strange history of Briarwood itself. Skeptics argue it could be a trick of the water. But when experts analyze the video, they confirm that the pale figure cast a measurable shadow on the lake floor. It wasn't an illusion. It was something physical. Adding to the mystery, investigators noticed the glinting object captured in the footage wasn't random. It appears to be metallic, possibly a flashlight, the same kind one of the teenagers was last seen carrying that night in 1974. How could it still be there after half a century? And why now? After years of silence, has the lake revealed it? The footage has reignited debates about Briarwood's closure and whether the disappearances were the result of foul play, an accident, or something much stranger. Officials have announced a new survey of the lake, but residents of Hollow Creek remain divided. Some demand answers, while others warn that reopening Briarwood means disturbing something that was never meant to be uncovered. And yet, the question remains, if the lake has kept its secrets for 50 years, why is it starting to give them up now? The decision to reopen Briarwood Lake didn't come quietly. Within days of the drone footage going public, Hollow Creek was split down the middle. On one side stood families of the missing, demanding answers after half a century of silence. On the other, locals who wanted nothing disturbed, whispering that the lake had claimed what it wanted and should be left alone. The sheriff, now in his final year before retirement, reluctantly signed off on a survey of the lake, though his hollow eyes betrayed a truth he wouldn't admit. He had grown up here. He knew the legends too well. The first complication came quickly. Environmental experts warned that dredging the lake would damage fragile ecosystems. Conspiracy-minded locals seized on this, claiming the officials were using environmental excuses to hide what they'd really find. Meanwhile, journalists swarmed Hollow Creek, digging into the archives, interviewing witnesses, and stirring old wounds. The story had gone national. Among the voices drawn back into the light was Linda Harrow, the childhood best friend of one of the missing teenagers. Now in her 60s, she revealed a detail she'd buried for decades. The night of the disappearances, she remembered hearing a strange melody drifting across the lake, like someone humming a lullaby in the dark. No one believed her at the time, so she stayed silent. But when she saw the drone footage, she said her stomach dropped. The pale figure in the water, she swore, had the same posture as her friend, the girl who vanished. As officials prepared to lower sonar equipment into the lake, another obstacle surfaced. Locals began protesting near the chained gates, holding lanterns and signs. "Leave Briarwood alone," one sign read. Another, "Disturb it, and it will disturb you." Tensions flared when a grieving father shouted back at them, his voice cracking that his daughter had never come home, and that silence was worse than any curse. Even within the investigation team, fractures grew. One diver privately admitted he didn't want to go in. He'd heard too many stories about how divers before him had come back trembling, swearing they felt something brush against them in the murky water. But orders were orders. Still, the hesitation was there, a quiet dread among the crew that rippled into every step of preparation. And then came the second piece of footage. This time, not from a drone, but from a local teenager with a phone. He had snuck past the barriers at night, drawn to the lake by the thrill of danger. His shaky video captured the moonlit water, perfectly still. But then ripples spread outward from the center, slow, deliberate, as if something beneath had stirred. Just before the clip ends, the boy gasps, his flashlight catching what appears to be a pale hand breaking the surface before vanishing again. The town is now teetering on the edge of panic. Parents are keeping their children indoors. Reporters are circling like vultures. The lake, once a place of laughter and sunlight, has become a stage where grief, fear, and obsession collide. And through it all, one question grows louder. If Briarwood is finally speaking, who or what is it trying to call back? The morning of the lake survey arrived under a sky heavy with storm clouds, as though even nature hesitated to see what would be uncovered. Crews set up floodlights and sonar equipment along the shoreline, their reflections cutting across the black surface of the water. The air was thick with humidity and unease. Locals gathered beyond the barricades, their whispers traveling like static through the trees. Every sound felt amplified, the crunch of boots, the metallic clang of gear, the low hum of machines. The sheriff gave the order. Divers prepared their suits in silence. One, a veteran with decades of underwater rescues behind him, paused long enough to whisper a prayer. The others avoided eye contact. They all knew the stories. They all remembered what the last diver had claimed. Something cold had brushed his leg, something he swore wasn't fish. Then came the first sonar reading. A shape, large, motionless, resting deep at the center of the lake. The technician adjusted the monitor, his voice unsteady as he repeated, "It's not natural." The image showed a mass with angles too sharp to be rock, too precise to be driftwood. Officials exchanged tense glances, the sheriff's jaw tightening as he muttered, "Could be debris or something else." Word spread instantly among the crowd. A wave of murmurs rose. Some cried out in anger, "Finally proof," while others shouted warnings to stop. Protesters rattled the barricades, demanding the survey end. In the chaos, Linda Harrow, the woman who claimed to hear the lullaby in '74, collapsed into tears. She whispered that if they pulled something up, it wouldn't come alone. The divers entered the water. One by one, their flashlights pierced the murky depths, beams of light cutting into shadows. On the surface, the crowd held its breath. Minutes stretched. The lake seemed to hold them longer than it should, swallowing light, sound, and courage. Then, suddenly, static crackled through the divers' comms. There's something down here." His breathing turned ragged. Another diver's voice broke in. "Wait. Don't," the line cut. Above, the monitors flickered. The sonar blip shifted. Whatever had been still was moving. Slowly, toward the divers. The technician slammed buttons, trying to recalibrate, but the mass grew clearer, a long structure almost like a collapsed cabin, yet not. Within the shifting haze, smaller shapes seemed to cluster around it. Watching, on shore, the sheriff barked for the divers to surface, but no one emerged. The crowd erupted, some screaming, some fleeing, others frozen in place, staring at the water. The teenager with the phone from earlier pushed forward, filming everything. His lens caught what others missed. Ripples spreading across the lake in a perfect circle, as though the water itself was breathing. The tension snapped. One diver's flashlight suddenly broke the surface, bobbing on the waves. But it was alone, no hand attached, no diver rising behind it. And in that suffocating moment of silence, a sound carried across the lake. A faint, melodic humming. Low, familiar, exactly as Linda had described 50 years ago. The sheriff froze, his face pale. He had heard that sound before. The humming grew louder, threading through the storm winds like a voice both near and impossibly far. People clamped their hands over their ears, yet the sound seemed to come from inside their heads. The sheriff shouted for the divers again, but silence answered. Only the bobbing flashlight remained, a small, haunting reminder of the lives still below. Then the monitors changed. The sonar screen, which had shown only the shifting mass, now displayed something new, movement along the shoreline. Figures, not in the water but on land. The technician froze. There's something else out there. The crowd turned, searching the tree line. For a breathless moment, nothing stirred. Then, out of the shadows, someone stepped forward. It was the gray-haired brother of the missing child. His eyes glistened, not with grief, but with something sharper. Determination. He walked past the barricade, ignoring the sheriff's protests, and raised his voice above the storm. "You're not going to find them down there," he said, "because they never left." The words cracked the crowd open with confusion. Some gasped. Others shouted for him to explain. But his gaze locked on the water, unwavering. Slowly, painfully, he confessed that on the night of 1974, he had seen more than a shadow in the trees. He had seen the campers, his brother among them, walking willingly toward the lake, guided by someone they trusted. The revelation hit like a blow. For years, he had carried this secret, ashamed, terrified of what it meant. But now, with the humming returning, he admitted the truth. He recognized the figure who led them. It wasn't a stranger. It was one of the counselors. A man still alive, still living quietly on the edge of town. The crowd erupted, accusations flying. Some cursed the man for staying silent all these years. Others defended him, insisting trauma clouded his memory. But the sheriff's face went white. He remembered that counselor. He remembered closing the file under pressure, told by higher-ups that the town needed peace, not panic. He had buried the lead, and with it the truth. Before the chaos could settle, a scream pierced the night. One of the floodlights toppled, sparks showering the wet ground. People scattered as the water surged upward, waves slamming against the barricades. And then something surfaced. Not a diver, not a boat, a cabin. The very same one that collapsed decades ago, its rotted roof breaking the water like a coffin forced open. Through shattered beams, shapes moved, indistinct, pale, yet undeniably human. Linda Harrow fainted on the spot. The crowd screamed. The sheriff staggered back as the humming shifted into voices, layered, overlapping, like children singing off-key. And beneath it all, the brothers' trembling words carried the weight of betrayal. They didn't drown. They were taken. The cabin rose higher, beams groaning as though dragged upward by unseen hands. The lake boiled around it, waves slapping against the shore in unnatural rhythms. Panic split the crowd. Half fled into the trees while others clung to the barricades, unwilling to look away. The humming grew into a chorus, hauntingly childlike, filling the night with a melody that seemed to echo from both water and sky. The sheriff staggered forward, his face pale under the strobing sparks of broken floodlights. He knew this song. He had heard it 50 years ago, on the night the case was sealed. He had buried it with the reports, with the guilt, with the faces of the children he could never forget. Now it was back, undeniable, demanding to be answered. The gray-haired brother dropped to his knees, tears streaming as he shouted into the storm. "Why did you follow him? Why didn't you run?" His voice cracked, echoing across the water. For a moment, the shapes inside the cabin stilled, frozen as if they heard him. Then one figure stepped forward, clearer than the rest. A boy's face, pale and waterlogged, but unmistakable. It was his brother. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The apparition raised a hand, pointing not at the water, but at the tree line. The crowd turned. Standing there, half hidden in the shadows, was an old man. Frail, hollow-eyed. The counselor. The sheriff's gun shook in his hand, but it was too late. The water surged again, dragging the cabin closer to shore. The counselor fell to his knees, clutching his head, as if the voices were tearing through him. "I didn't take them," he screamed. "They chose. They followed." His words were desperate, broken, but no one could tell if they were truth or madness. The brother lurched forward, fury and grief warring on his face. He wanted justice. He wanted answers. But as he reached the water's edge, the pale figure of his brother lowered its hand and shook its head slowly, sorrowfully. The message was clear. The living could not follow where they had gone. The lake erupted one final time, pulling the cabin back beneath its surface with a roar that shook the trees. The shapes vanished. The humming cut off, leaving only the sound of rain and human sobbing. When the waters stilled, nothing remained. No cabin, no figures, no sign of what had just unfolded. Only the abandoned flashlight floated quietly at the surface, circling in the ripples. The sheriff dropped his weapon and whispered into the silence. "We weren't meant to save them. We were meant to remember." But as the crowd dispersed, shaken and broken, the teenager with the phone replayed his footage. His hands trembled when he saw a detail the others missed. In the final seconds, just before the cabin sank, one pale figure wasn't retreating. It was climbing out, onto the shore, and the camera caught its wet footprints leading into the dark. The storm finally eased over Briarwood Lake, leaving behind a gray, trembling dawn. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only the sheriff, the gray-haired brother, and a few local officials staring at the still, empty waters. The lake had given up its secret, but only partially. The missing campers remained gone, their fate unclear, their presence now lingering in memory, footage, and whispered stories. The brother knelt at the shore, picking up the flashlight that had floated free. It was battered, waterlogged, but it bore the scratches and initials of his sibling. Tears streaked down his face as he traced the familiar marks. "They're gone," he whispered, "but we remember. That's what matters." The realization settled over him. Some truths are too deep to reclaim fully, yet the act of remembering, of honoring, can offer a measure of peace. Linda Harrow returned to the pier, her hands trembling. She had hoped, for decades, to see her friend again. Instead, she carried the memory of the lullaby, the pale figure, and a haunting sense that Briarwood held its own judgment. She understood now that some mysteries are not meant to be solved entirely. Some echoes are left to teach, not to satisfy. The sheriff walked quietly behind them, reflecting on decades of buried secrets. He had faced grief, guilt, and moral compromise, but the lake's revelation had reminded him that accountability doesn't always mean intervention. Sometimes it is enough to bear witness, to hold the memory of the missing, and to ensure history does not forget them. Hollow Creek slowly returned to a fragile calm. The campground gates were left chained, the waters untouched, and the forest began to reclaim the land as if nothing had happened. Yet the town had changed. The voices of the past, once silenced, now resonated in conversations, in journalism, and in personal reflection. People spoke about courage, about grief, about the moral weight of choices made long ago. And the lake itself seemed at peace for now. The pale figures had vanished beneath the surface, leaving only ripples and questions. But those ripples carried lessons. That memory can honor the lost, that courage is measured not by confrontation but by acknowledgement, and that sometimes the answers we seek are less important than the understanding we gain. As the gray-haired brother walked away from the water, he paused and looked back one last time. The lake lay still, almost ordinary in its silence, yet he felt the weight of what had occurred. He whispered, "We cannot change what happened, but we can carry it forward." And in that quiet reflection, Briarwood's legacy became clear. Some places are haunted not by what they hide, but by what we choose to remember.